There we go. You're on mute, Mark.
Muted.
Hi, everybody. This is Mark Bernstein. This is Tinderbox Meetup, and it's already December 3rd, 2023. How'd that happen? In 2 weeks, on December 17th, we're going to have the big Tinderbox book roundup with an overview of everything related to notes and Tinderbox, scholarly books, self-help books, manuals, books on allied topics like mathematical notation, and plotting, the whole shebang. So bring your stack of new and old Tinderbox books. That's in 2 weeks. But this week we have Jorge Arango, information architect, and of course your problems, headaches, and new projects. So here's Tinderbox Meetup, and here's Michael Becker.
Hi, everybody. Excited for today's session. Jorge and I have been talking about having him show up now for, 6 months or so? So it's super excited to have him. And congratulations on the new book, which you'll be talking about as well. So, but before we get into that, typical Tinderbox Meetup forum, we go around the room and we have new people introduce themselves if they would like. We would then jump into any particular project or question about Tinderbox or note-taking or whatever they may be working on. And then we would go into any set theme, and then we would, barring extra time, we would get into whatever crazy concepts or topics we want to talk about. Today, since we have a set theme and a guest speaker, let's jump right after our introductions. We'll jump right into that, and then if we time permitting, we can talk about any particular projects or problems that we may have. For example, my in particular one is integrating my stats tool with Tinderbox and learning how to interpret the numbers of my statistics that I'm working through. But that's something we can talk about later. Looking around the room, I see a few new names. I haven't seen Rolf before, Martin or Clemmy. If you all want to introduce yourself briefly to the community, welcome. It's great to have you here. And I'm curious as to what brought you here and what you're interested in learning. And if not, we can jump right in. All right, looks like they want to stay on mute. So with that in mind, let's just jump. Rolf, go ahead.
Hey, hello. I'm from Austria, and I'm teaching information architecture. And so I read that Jorge Arango is speaking here, and that brought me here.
Welcome. Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for joining the community. All right, with that in mind, let's let's jump right in. The floor is yours. You got about an hour and a half, and let's talk about note-taking and knowledge management.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael.
Architecture.
Yeah, it's all one and the same. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Mark, for having me here. This is incredibly exciting to me. I am a long-term Tinderbox user, and I have been part of some of these conversations in the community before as a listener and light participant. And I also have to admit right up front that I'm also a little anxious because I get the sense that some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about, there are folks in this call who are likely very knowledgeable on these subjects, right? So I would love to make this a conversation. I do have some slides and some prepared remarks. I want to tell you about this book that I've written, but I'm really hoping that this will turn into a conversation of sorts. And what I'll do is I'll just tell you about what I'm working on, what I'm interested in right now, and the subject of this book, and then I'm hoping we'll open it up and talk about it. So let me share my screen.
And then can you get us a link to your book so we can buy it, as well as a link to your newsletter, because I love your newsletter. It's awesome.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes, I have a link to the book, and I will post the link to both of those things in the chat. Let me first share my screen here. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Great. All right, fantastic. So I'm going to start by giving you a very brief overview on where I'm coming from. So I am an independent information architect. So I'm a consultant, author, and educator. I have been designing user experiences for digital media. That's the way that I'm describing it. I've been doing this for coming up on 3 decades now. So I've been doing this now for a while. And I'm also an adjunct professor at the Graduate Interaction Design program in the California College of the Arts. I co-authored the 4th edition of the O'Reilly Information Architecture book, which is affectionately known as the Polar Bear. And I also published a book about information architecture about 5 years ago called Living in Information. But now I have a new book coming out, as Michael said, and it is not a book, on the surface at least, it's not a book about information architecture. It's a book about note-taking. It's called Duly Noted. And you might be wondering why a UX designer is writing about note-taking or interested in note-taking. And the answer is that in doing this kind of work over all this time, I've noticed that the effectiveness of knowledge workers, and I consider a lot of us, perhaps everyone in this call likely is a knowledge worker, right? Like people who make their living in some way working with information. And the realization that I've had is that the effectiveness of knowledge workers is capped in some way by our ability to find and use information. So the better that we are at doing this, the more effective we will be. And as a knowledge worker myself, as a consultant, teacher, author, etc., I've realized that many of the principles and practices that I use to organize information systems for others can also help me organize my own information better, and as a result, help me think better. So this book is my attempt to reflect what I've learned from working in information architecture over all these years that's helped me think better in today's complex information environments. And when I say complex information environments, I want to kind of call out what makes our current environments different. I think that we are living in a time that presents both deep challenges to doing this kind of work and also unparalleled opportunities, right? So the challenges include the sort of things that we're all familiar with. Too much information. There's this idea of information overload. In the 1980s, Richard Saul Wurman published a book called Information Anxiety, which is one of the founding texts in information architecture, and it tackles this idea of information overload, right? So even back then, before the internet, people were already seeing this. There's also this notion that we have a lot of information, but we have a pretty poor signal to noise ratio happening. And this, I feel this very kind of like as an ambient thing, but I felt it very strongly recently when there was this whole kerfuffle about OpenAI and that shuffle they had in their leadership. I was paying attention to what was going on there, and there was a period of about 72 hours where there was a lot of chatter. There were a lot of people posting about this stuff, and it became evident very quickly that a lot of people were posting speculation and things that were primarily opinions that were unfounded or at least not grounded in facts. And the few facts that had come out during that period were drowned out by this sea of just speculative stuff. So that's an issue. And the third one that is very evident is fragmentation. When I was growing up, we had 3 or 4 TV channels, a handful of newspapers, local newspapers at that, right? And some magazines. And beyond books and stuff like that, that was the extent of the means that we had to make sense of what was going on around us. And now we are in a situation where we have hundreds of millions of sources available and competing for our attention. So it's tough, right? It's tough to make sense of what's going on in this environment. But we have to acknowledge that there are also these incredible opportunities. We have access to way more information than any human beings have ever had before, right? So that's a good thing. I'm always amazed when I'm like standing in the line for the checkout at the supermarket, and I pull out my phone and I can, find the most arcane facts just right there on the line, right? So this is astonishing that we can do this. We also have unparalleled access to people. The kind of meeting that we're having right now was inconceivable when I started my career. The fact that we can come together from different countries, different backgrounds on a Sunday and just, dial in to this call and come together is really quite something, and it's something that's enabled by these technologies. So we have to acknowledge that that's an improvement. And then the final point, which I want to elaborate a bit on, is that we have incredible tools to work with information. And this matters because many of the principles that I'll be talking about today have been around for a long time. Next year, it's going to be my 20th anniversary of using Tinderbox. And many of the principles that I'm going to be talking about are embodied by Tinderbox. So I don't think that any of these things are new per se. But what's happened is that there's been a combination of the World Wide Web, which brought ideas of hyperlinking, for example, and wikis in particular to the mainstream. So I think that there's a greater openness or a greater understanding now in the mainstream about the capabilities of these systems. And then the other factor is that cloud computing has made it much easier, faster, and cheaper to develop and deliver software. So there's a lot of experimentation happening. And I've noticed that over the last 5 years or so, there's been a plethora of new tools that have appeared in the market that are not aimed at researchers. They're not aimed at specialists, that bring many of these capabilities to a broader audience. So I've had this idea in my mind for a while. It's like, it'd be great to have a book that talks about information architecture, but in the context of your own personal information. But now seems like a good time because there are all these tools coming on board. And I'm talking about things like Obsidian and Rome Research and Notion, right? That have gained some traction in the last few years. And the key question that I think that we must grapple with as we try to make sense of things and think clearly in this new environment was articulated by this question that Howard Rheingold posed in his book, Mind Amplifier. He said, instead of asking whether the web and the various devices connected to it are making us stupid, what if we could mindfully design and use digital media to make us smarter? I love this idea. This is an inspiring idea to me. In fact, I was very inspired by Howard's book, Tools for Thought, and I am thrilled to be able to say that Howard agreed to write the foreword to Duly Noted. And part of the reason why this is so inspiring to me is that the implication here is that we aren't limited to the wetware that we were born with, right? So our nervous system and our sensory apparatus, our capabilities. If we realize that we can use tools and environments to augment our cognitive abilities, then all of a sudden we have agency in the matter. So that's the kind of underlying goal here. It's like, how do we set ourselves up to be better thinkers? And if the idea is to think better, then you might be wondering, well, why focus on notes? And The reason why I gravitated toward notes as the kind of object of interest in this book is that notes are a way for us to externalize our thinking. And the important thing to realize there is that thinking isn't constrained by the brain and the nervous system. Instead, thinking is something that happens when you interact with things, other beings, and our environments. There's a book called Figure It Out by Carl Fast and Steven Anderson that covers this topic. And Carl and Steven have a really good illustration of this idea in the book. They present the image of a pile of coins. So imagine that you're facing a pile of coins of different denominations, and you're trying to add them up to get a sense of how much money there is on the table. You will find that you are going to be able to do this cognitive task much more easily if you can use your finger to move the coins around and group them into piles organized by the type of coin, right? So if you realize that you have 3 quarters, 5 dimes, and 7 nickels, then the calculation is a lot easier in your mind than if you were just like looking at this pile and trying to figure out how much money there is. So that's an example of you using your environment as part of your cognitive apparatus. And we do this as well when we sit down, for example, with a pen and paper to sketch out a project plan. What you're doing when you do that, you're not recording on the paper the things that are happening in your brain. What you're doing is that you're establishing this feedback loop between your brain, your sensory apparatus, and the paper and pen. And all of these things are functioning in some way as the thinking system. This is an idea that was proposed by Andy Clark and David Chalmers in 1998 in a paper called The Extended Mind, which postulates that external tools, devices, and environments become integral parts of our cognitive processes. There's a really great book which brings these ideas to a more lay audience it's also called The Extended Mind by Annie Murphy Paul. And these ideas have been very influential to my own thinking. It's a thesis that makes a lot of sense to me because it matches my experience as a designer, author, and teacher. I mean, I've seen this play out. Designers work with their hands in some way, even digital designers. And sketching is an important part of the design process. So if you buy into this idea that we think with things, you realize that mindfully organizing your environments and the tools and information within our environments, then you can amplify your cognitive abilities. And notes are a very important means for articulating thoughts. Now, it's important to acknowledge that this word notes is somewhat loaded. We use it to mean a lot of different things. So a note can be a sticky note on your refrigerator door reminding your partner to buy cheese. But a note can also be the sketch for a project plan that I was talking about earlier, right? Or the highlights and marginalia that you capture in a Kindle book when you're reading it. It can also be the rough transcript that you're making while listening to a lecture like this one, right? So we call all of these things notes, but they serve different purposes. And for many of us, they also are captured and expressed using different media, right? So it's important to acknowledge that because we have to be more mindful about how we're thinking. And many people assume that notes are primarily for remembering. My Mac, when I'm working on the book or on a presentation, I always have my dictionary open on the Mac, and the Mac's dictionary defines notes as a brief record of facts, topics, or thoughts written down as an aid to memory. And I think that that's how most people think of notes. They think of notes as a way to remember something. And notes can certainly help with that. It's one of the primary uses that I have for notes myself. But notes help with more than just remembering. They help with many other things, many other thinking tasks. And what tasks might those be? Well, it might include generating insights. It might include generating new things, right? So preparing this presentation was a thinking task. And I took lots of notes while I was doing that. Thinking also entails learning, updating your mental models. And an example of that might be sitting down to reflect what you learned after reading a long book. These activities are different from remembering. And in some ways, they are harder than remembering. And I say that they can be harder because, particularly for generative thinking activities, something like writing a book or preparing a presentation, we face two challenges that are not present when we're trying to remember something. The first challenge is that sometimes we have nothing to go on, right? Like we sit down, this is the famed blank sheet of paper curse, where you sit down to the thing and you go, oh no, what am I going to do now? Like I have to face this thing, right? And the other challenge that we often face is the complete opposite. It's like we sit down and we have too much stuff to work through. And I have to admit that for me, the second is often a bigger problem than the first. So when I was, for example, when I was preparing this presentation, I have all the material that went into the book, right? So I have this enormous pile of stuff. And the process becomes one of just putting all this or the relevant stuff out into the world somewhere that I can see it and move it around, manipulate it in much the same way that Carl and Stephen are manipulating the coins, right? And then in this process of manipulating it, I come to some kind of mean, right? And I show this drawing. This is a famous drawing by Damien Newman. At least it's famous in design circles. It's a drawing that represents the design process as a journey from research, insight generation, iteration, synthesis, and so on, eventually kind of leading to this single design solution that this single design solution where you've identified a path forward, right? And this is analogous to what happens in many thinking processes, particularly generative activities. Whenever I sit down to write a newsletter or a presentation or a book, I often think about this phrase from William James that he used to describe a newborn's experience of the world. He said that it was a blooming, buzzing confusion, right? And what you want to do is you want to get from this blooming, buzzing confusion to something that makes sense, at least makes sense to you, right? So to me, there's an analogy here with this diagram of or at least this diagram of the design process could also be an illustration of what's happening in the mind as we go about this. And what we want to do is we want to create environments that support these various thinking activities. So one way to think about how you might build environments to support these activities is to try to organize what the thinking activities are and how they're different from each other. And I've been working on this model for thinking activities, and this is one of the things that I was hoping we would have a conversation about, because you won't find this diagram in the book. This is, as often happens, it's like, I've kept thinking about the ideas in the book and keep thinking about how to present them, and I thought that this might be an interesting matrix to explore here. The idea is that thinking activities can fall in any one of the quadrants in this matrix that has two dimensions. On the horizontal axis, we go from activities that require remembering. So these are the memory augmentation things on the left, and those that involve creating things on the right. And on the vertical axis, we go from ideas that serve us for a long time at the top of the matrix to throwaway ideas at the bottom. So ideas that are not going to stick around, and you don't necessarily want them to, right? So this model, as I've been playing with it, and again, this is kind of very early stage for this model, and I would love to hear your feedback, but as I've been playing with it, I find that it describes a lot of the things that I do when I'm trying to think about stuff. And what you want to do is you want to build a system or a collection of systems that will support your particular needs. So when I start mapping out what I do against this model, and I'll show you my map, or the map that I have so far. But when I start making that map, I realize that it's a map that is going to be relevant to me. It's not necessarily going to be relevant to you. The idea is that you develop your own, right? I'm turned off by people who prescribe one size fits all knowledge management systems, because everyone has different needs, objectives, and preferences. And it's very easy to come to the table and say, this is the solution you want. Like, that's a sort of thing that has traction, right? Like, that goes viral when someone says, like, I have the answers. It's like, well, I don't necessarily have the answers for you. But what I do have is a set of underlying principles that I've learned both from my own work, but also from studying what other people have done before, that will hopefully allow you to roll your own, to build your own system. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to move over to Tinderbox to show you how I've started mapping my thinking environments. And I hope you can see that. So just to walk you real quick through what this is, I have yellow notes for well, as with many of the things that I do in Tinderbox, this is kind of messy right now. I have not fully thought it through. I'm sharing it with you because I really do want your feedback, and I will likely change many of these things after our conversation. But I was just taking notes here about things that I do or means that I use to capture things or think about things, and where they might fit in this landscape. And to give you an example, things that are mnemonic or primarily memory tasks and evergreen are things like my contacts, right? So I use the Apple default contacts app. And the reason why I use that application is because I don't want to have to remember people's emails and phone numbers. And this is something that for some of the relationships that are captured in my contacts application, those are people that I'm going to know for my lifespan, hopefully. So they are very evergreen, right? So these are things that I want to always keep around. And moving on to the lower left quadrant, an example of a task that is also mnemonic, but more transient would be something like a grocery list, right? So, if I'm going to, I'm sure you've had the experience of standing in the grocery aisles and going, oh no, why am I here? Why did I come here? What was I going to buy? So we make these lists, right? And for that, I use Apple Notes primarily. I sometimes use the Drafts app, which is the one in the middle here, but I primarily use Apple Notes for that. Another example would be keeping track of appointments, right? The things that you use a calendar for. Those are short-term. I'm not really going to care about the grocery list after I've bought the stuff. So it goes in the trash. And they're also memory-driven. Now, moving on to the right, we have the transient and generative part of this matrix. And this is where I'm sitting down to try to make sense of something, or I'm sitting down and trying to learn something, to to work through a problem at work, right? So an example of that might be writing a book. So when I've worked on particularly living in information and duly noted, the very first tool that I fired up was Tinderbox, because this is what I use Tinderbox for. I use Tinderbox as a kind of whiteboard with superpowers of some sort, where I can put up ideas. I'm a very visual person, so I put up ideas in the map view, and I can see them and move them around, and then I can flip to the outline view and explore them from that perspective, right? And I do this with the understanding that I am eventually going to move on from that visualization or that exploration, because in the case of a book, the final product is not the Tinderbox file, right? Like the final product is a text that you can buy, right? So this is part of a process and not the place where I'm keeping information for the long term. I mean, I can revisit these files later in the future, but they're not actively maintained. Moving up to the last quadrant here, the part of the matrix that deals with evergreen and generative things. That is what I call in the book a knowledge garden. And a knowledge garden is a kind of knowledge graph where you're growing ideas somehow. It's a place where the ideas live for the long term. And I'm going to talk about this particular quadrant in the rest of the conversation, so I'm not going to belabor it now. But I will just say up front that I know that there are probably some of you in this call who have a very different configuration for this, and you probably use Tinderbox as your knowledge garden. And you probably use Tinderbox as a tool to keep track of appointments or to keep track of to-dos. And I think that is perfectly fine. In fact, it's part, I think, and I'm saying this with the applications designer in the call, right? But I think it's part of the design of this application to be kind of open-ended in its uses, right? As compared to something like the contacts application on your phone, which is very clearly a single purpose thing, right? The contacts app is very clearly aimed at that upper left quadrant, whereas a tool like Tinderbox, I think, can cover the entire spectrum of this landscape. And that makes it both more powerful than many of these other apps on the board here, but it also makes it somehow more challenging to get into, right? Because you don't have rails like you do with a calendar app or a contact app. All right, I am going to pause here and see if there are any comments or questions. I want to, like I said, the rest of the talk here, I'm going to delve into the upper right quadrant, but I've been talking a long time and I do want to hear your thoughts. And I'm also going to open up the chat here to see what people are talking about.
Yeah, so maybe I can jump in with the first question and as other people think through. So first and foremost, that was just awesome. I really, really enjoyed it. So my thought for you though is there a process to it? You know, because I have like my 5C model. Like I like to walk things through steps. So
yeah,
is there a process that you have when taking notes, and how do you go from like the picture you just showed us to a note or list you may have created?
Yeah,
and getting that book in the end, and are there steps in that information architectural process that you think through?
There is a process, and I have a slide that shows it. Yeah, so let me give you a preview. This is a great setup for the rest of the prepared part of this talk. So I do have a few more slides that go into that upper right quadrant, including one that talks a bit about the process. But I can do that. Like if again, I want to make this very conversational. So if you all want to dive into that, we can do that. We can, I can pull up the diagram and talk about that in more depth. What I'm planning to do though in the rest of the slides is to share with you 3 rules or 3 principles that I think will address some of your concern there, Michael. They serve as kind of underlying principles that inform the way to work with such a system.
Got it. So we can park that since you're going to be talking about it later. Anybody else have any other questions before we try to move on to that? Chuck, please.
So a general question, which is something that's been on my mind a lot lately around this topic and many related, is we're entering into a new era where our tools are being extended in some ways that I don't think we've got complete handle as individuals or as a society on how we're going to deal with them. AI is the latest poster child in that regard. But one of the things that I don't see in a lot of the tools that are out there that I think will become very important in the future is provability of origin. It's a security concept that, in the security world, there are other names that get applied to it. But the idea is that who originated an idea and what was their original form of it?
Yeah.
And how has someone else taken that original form and improved it, or, as is so often the case these days, warped it into ways that wind up being misleading or misdirecting? And I think that one of the concerns I have with our tools is they haven't kept up with this somewhat dangerous new era. And I'm wondering if, in your thinking about notes, and I like your structure there, your 4 quadrants. I think it makes a lot of sense, and it certainly fits with my own thinking about it. But what about this issue of maintaining provability?
Yeah.
Not allowing for unintended modifications by others, things of that nature. And have you thought about that in your work on Duly Noted?
Yeah, for sure. There's a section on this. And I feel like I might have done you all a disservice by pausing now for questions, because some of this is covered in the last part of this. But I will say that well, first of all, like you're acknowledging, or like you're calling out there, all this stuff is very emergent, and we still don't know how things are gonna play out with regards to this stuff. And I know that in the AI world, this notion of transparency is a big deal. It's very important for us. Well, I'll talk about these rules or principles in the last part of the thing. And one of them is, I'll just say this as a kind of like teaser. One of them is very much oriented toward trying to alleviate the problem of losing provenance, at least within your own knowledge graph. And then we can talk a bit about how AI might fit into that. Right. So let's yeah, go ahead.
If I can insert those, since we're having a conversation, if that's
Yeah.
okay. So in my world of personal data and digital identity, the idea of authenticity of an identity and the ability for the owner of that identity to maintain either, totally out there in the public, I am who I am, or remain anonymous, but yet still controller of that identity. That's a very important kind of spectrum in that process. And so there's a lot of new interesting cryptographic tools that are being evolved, and particularly under the auspices of what's called self-sovereign identity, or the WC3, the purveyors of the HTTP internet standard, is adding a new layer in called the solid layer, which is a new protocol that will be enabling us to be able to cryptographically sign content as it's flowing through the internet, both in terms of our human individual identities, but as well as mechanics for being able to sign content. And Adobe has an content authenticity initiative that's using this new standard. so that, for example, in the probably sometime in 2024, the release of any of the Adobe product suites, the content will automatically be cryptographically signed by its creator. And that at that point, as that content starts flowing out into the world, using anywhere from either some form of blockchain or other types of call home methods, or even leveraging what's called the carry protocol, a self-resolving cryptographic standard, you will be able to address what Chuck is talking about. So Chuck, if you want to talk about it offline, we can, but there's some really interesting movement on these cryptographic libraries being instilled into tools for that very reason.
Yeah, I'm moderately familiar with a lot of that. And this is sort of in my background, but I just point out that the people in this meetup are well aware of the fact I make this point often. But the note tool that I think gets overlooked all the time is email, which often includes a contact database and a calendar and a to-do capability, and it fits into all four quadrants. And for those of us who know how to master the magic, if you add an SMIME certificate, or you can also fool around with PGP, you have the ability to literally digitally sign everything you send out to the world, but also anything you save for yourself automatically. Just never even have to think about it, and you prove time, origin, and that proof of that it hasn't been modified, integrity. So things like this have existed, and part of what I find curious is how long it took the HTML standards bodies to even get around to thinking about this stuff, even though SMIME goes back to the early 90s. So there's a lot of, and it's MIME, which is a well understood means of representing data. So part of my interest in this is not just what are the new tools going to do to begin to incorporate solutions to some of these challenges, but also why on earth has it taken so long for us to implement what has been around for decades? So it's just two sides of the same coin. So I'll shut up. That's all. I just wanted to raise the issue. And
on that point, Chuck, I mean, Jorge, can you talk about that? I mean, what popped in my head there was usability.
Yeah, I mean, the thought that came to mind, and I don't know, Chuck, if this is what you were referring to when you were talking about provenance, is I'm reading a book right now where the foreword of the book is credited to the author, and he lists as co-authors ChatGPT, Claude, and a third LLM that I don't remember, right? And my thinking when I read that was, I'm sure that there are a lot of names behind ChatGPT, Claude, and whatever other LLM, because that text came from somewhere, right? And that part of the provenance is what I think is lost, right? Like, because it's a bit of a black box. And I think it's an issue, and I don't think it's resolved in any way yet. But
right.
But I think we should move on, because Steve has a question, and David Eddy has a question as well. So, and I do want to circle back to the rest of the slides. Steve, you wanna speak?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I like the matrix a lot. It answers questions for me. My experience, though, is that I start with a to-do list, and my brain keeps on coming back to certain items that to-do list, more detail and more detail, and I continue to add that together. I'm sort of, my brain is dragging me from that side, which is sort of the to-do list side, over to the other side of the matrix, going into a project plan and so on. So perhaps there's a dimension for some of these things that is the evolution. That
Yes.
is, things start out simple, and then they start to flower with all sorts of additional detail, and they become generative.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that mirrors my experience as well. You said the to-do list. For me, it often starts with an outline of some sort, or just like putting up notes in a Tinderbox map view, right? So and it's a similar thing. And what I find is that when I see these things in the world, they spur other ideas in a way that just won't happen if it's just me thinking about it in my, in the meat computer, you know. Um, and I will say this is one of the things that I personally find LLMs most helpful for. It's like overcoming this blank page thing, where like you can ask it for a little like give me an outline of things that I should be thinking about when thinking about this. And I find that at least with GPT-4, it does a pretty good job at that. So that and I do get into this in the book, but I'm not looking to have the system do the writing for me. I want it to somehow assist me. Or have you heard the phrase rubber ducking, where like you treat the LLM as a rubber duck, and you're like just asking it questions and just know, like, even if it answers nonsense, the fact that it helped you formulate the question is helpful, right? But yeah, there is an evolution from one tool medium to another, and it's one of the reasons why I love Tinderbox, frankly, because I find that I can work in the outline view and then shift to the map view, and that changes my perspective on what I'm doing, and that shift of perspective kind of nudges my thinking in very useful ways. And it happens also when jumping between tools. Someone wrote in Emacs, and I chuckled because this presentation that I'm sharing with you today, I started in Tinderbox, and then I moved over to org mode in Emacs, and I kind of typed it out as an outline and fleshed it out because it's more of a text editor for me, right? And I keep going back and forth. When I thought about what I wanted to say, then I came back to the matrix and started populating it. So I'm between Emacs and between Emacs, Tinderbox, and Google Slides, I developed this talk that I'm giving today. So those are part of my thinking apparatus. David, you've been waiting patiently.
You touched the tender button on the books. So on a Sunday, when I was a kid, we would have, this is when newspapers were 4 to 5 pounds each.
Mm-hmm.
And so that we would have the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Washington Star. But anyway, to Chuck, the reason it's so slow, I would argue, with all this fancy horsepower we have at our fingertips, it absolutely slows down our ability to actually make sense out of it and gain consensus. Witness my professional dealings right now in large-scale provenance questions. Somehow people think that if they're sitting on top of a 150-year-old software portfolio, I mean, there's no difference between ledger books and software. The software just expresses the ledgers. People somehow think they can snap their fingers. Can't be done. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of politics. And just because we have these magical tools, W3C, I mean, semantic web still doesn't touch semantics at all, as far as I know. It's about mathematics. It's about the semantics of mathematics. Semantic web is not about the semantics of meaning. A wonderful sleight of hand. But anyway, so especially for Chuck, there's so much. I mean, look, if you got two choices, you can A or B, flip a coin, who cares? And if choice B was wrong, you go back to A. No skin off your, no skin lost. If you got 100 choices, you do nothing. So that's
David, I think you're illustrating what I was trying to convey, this idea that you have to make the system your own, right? There's no one right solution, and this entails experimentation. I tried using Tinderbox as my long-term repository. It didn't fulfill that role for me, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a role in my information ecosystem. And it there's no other way about it. I think it takes time. It takes time to experiment and to, try these things and find out what works for you.
I mean, look in your physical toolbox. How many different screwdrivers do you have?
Right.
How many different hammers do you have? Wrenches.
Right. And if you're someone who has made knowledge work your life's work, it behooves you to become intimate with your tools. It's part of the job. Dave, I see your hand up. I'm going to make a note of the fact that you have your hand up. I do want to circle back to the rest of the slides here because
well, and just as a moderator check-in, just so you know, we've got about 40 minutes, so we've got a lot of time. So there's no rush and there's no hurry.
Yeah, I just don't, there are some questions coming up that I think might be, especially the early ones, might be addressed by some of these slides, and I don't want to lose these last few ideas. There aren't that many, and we can then circle back to the conversation because this is good stuff that's coming up. All right, I'm back to sharing Google Slides. Hopefully you can see that, and well, like I said, over the years, I've been developing workflows and tools and processes and just trying to set things up to assist me with all four of these things. And for me, I think a big realization was to recognize that these are different activities and that, like we were saying, some tools can help you with some, others are more specialized and help you with others. And that realization was helpful to me in kind of focusing the subject of the book. So duly noted is focused on the upper right quadrant. When I first started thinking about this subject, it was about 5 or 6 years ago that I had the first conversation with my publisher about working on this book, and I was saying, and I said, I want to help people kind of organize their information better. But when I started researching it, I realized that, that means so much. Like, am I going to help them organize their contacts list? No, like that's not the interesting part of this, at least to me. So I'm very focused on the upper right quadrant. And again, this is, I'm looking to build a system to assist with generative thinking over my entire lifespan. And I call this system a knowledge garden. And I want to talk a little bit about this metaphor of the garden. Some of you might be familiar with Lakoff and Johnson's book on metaphors. And this book, I think it's called The Metaphors We Live By, right? And anyway, they frame they say that metaphors are super important to us, right? Like they frame and influence our thinking. So we must be very careful. Well, first of all, we must be conscious of the metaphors we use, right? A lot of it happens unconsciously. But once we're conscious of it, then we can become kind of proactive in picking our metaphors. And there are a lot of metaphors out there right now for this kind of work. Well, not a lot, but there's several different metaphors. One that I've heard talked about a lot is the second brain. I think that was popularized by Tiago Forte, right? That's a very popular one, and I think that it's brought a lot of folks into this realm of personal knowledge management, which is a good thing. But I'm not entirely sold on this idea that what you're building here is some kind of prosthetic brain. In particular, because I think that it raises some of the questions, particularly the questions that you brought up, Chuck, about the role of artificial intelligences in this, right? Like if you're building a second brain, then how does that relate to something like ChatGPT? So I'm much more comfortable talking about this stuff using a place metaphor. So that the thing that we are making is not a prosthetic brain, in my mind. It's some kind of place where you go to extend and augment your existing cognitive abilities, right? You go to a garden. It's a separate place. You do work in a garden. So this is not going to do the work for you. This is a place where you go to do work. And we also take pleasure from being in a garden, right? So you walk there in the cool of the evening, the book says. So I think that it's important to use a place metaphor when talking about this stuff. And I have to say that this gardening metaphor isn't original to me. There's a long history of people referring to hypertext thinking places as gardens. I had the privilege of hosting Mr. Bernstein on my podcast, where he mentioned that Kathy Marshall at Xerox PARC used the phrase information gardening many, many years ago to describe these sorts of things. So it's been around for a long time, and digital gardens are a thing now. You might have heard that phrase being kicked around, and digital gardens are like public versions of the sort of thing that I'm talking about in the book. But what's funny is I didn't come to this metaphor through the industry or through the research that's been done here. I actually came to the metaphor through the work of Brian Eno, the musician and record producer. And Eno wrote an essay where he contrasted gardening with architecture. And I didn't mention this at the beginning, but my own background is in architecture. That's what I studied. So I kind of like, this kind of spoke to me. And the point that he makes in this essay is that architects, when they're designing a building, they must plan the details out up front, right? So they must know what they're going to be building before people go on the construction site and start moving materials and stuff. So it's kind of a top-down activity. And he contrasts this with what a gardener does, which is to create structures that allow the place to grow and take form and evolve organically, right? So it's more, it's not that it's entirely bottom up, but you're creating the structures that will allow bottom up emergence somehow. And I really like this distinction, and even if it's not entirely fair to architects, I find it useful to contrast this kind of very rigid, pre-planned, top-down, prescriptive approach where you've defined all categories and all organizational structures up front, to a more loose one where what you're doing is you're creating kind of trellises for things to emerge organically. And like a physical garden, a knowledge garden can yield fruit and pleasure, right? It's a place where I at least enjoy sitting down and working with my thoughts in this little place that I'm building. But like I said, it requires work and it requires dedication. Like I have a job in that I have clients that I need to service, and I have classes that I need to teach. I have commitments that I need to do, and the time that I spend working on my knowledge garden is time that I'm not generating revenue, let's say, at least not directly, right? But I am cognizant that my work, both as a consultant, as an author, and as a teacher, is only going to yield fruit to the degree that it is informed by the work that I am doing in this knowledge garden, right? So it's ultimately going to yield fruit, but it's going to yield fruit and pleasure to the degree that I'm willing to invest in it. And the book explains how to design, build, and operate a knowledge garden. At least staying true to this idea that you have to make it your own. So I'm not very prescriptive about what tools to use. Rather, what I do is I lay out some principles that you must keep in mind, and I'm not going to share those in a lot of detail today. Michael, I will show you the diagram that you asked for, but what I wanted to share with you here was kind of like the three underlying rules. Like as I was thinking about this, and in conversations with my friend Carl Fast, who I referenced earlier about the book Figure It Out. He read early copies of the book, and he kind of nudged me to try to articulate the foundations of this thing as a set of rules, like very simple rules. And these are the rules that I came up with. The rules are just three. you must make short notes, you must connect your notes, and you must nurture your notes. And I'll tell you really quickly about all three. So the first principle is that you must make short notes. And you might have heard, if you've been in personal knowledge management circles as of late, you might have heard the phrase atomic notes used. And this is kind of what I mean by this. The idea here is that you build the discipline to have each note you take capture the essence of one idea and no more than that. So that each note is the place where one idea lives for you somehow. And the thing that's tricky about this is that you have to determine for yourself how much is too little and how much is too much information. So I've had it happen to me that I come across an interesting idea and I just capture like the title of the thing and maybe a link. And then I come back to it a year later and I have no idea why I captured the thing. I'm like, what is this? Like, I have no context, right? So one of the things that I encourage the reader of the book to do is to consider that you're taking notes for an audience, and the audience is you of the future. So future you, right? Like the person who is going to open this a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. Like the thing that you're capturing needs to have enough context for you to know what it was about and to pick right back up. But the gist of it, is that it be focused on that one main idea. So one way to think about it is like, why is this meaningful to me, right? Why am I capturing this? Or how does this relate to my work as I understand it right now? That kind of thing. So like I said, the book offers some ideas about how to go about doing this, but the key takeaway is one note, one idea. And they usually start, at least for me, they start fairly short. This is very different from how I used to take notes as a kid, where, I would just dump everything onto the page. I've had to like train myself to not dump everything onto a single note, but to think, okay, this is one idea, this is one idea, this is one idea. And the reason why I can do this, why I can take notes in this kind of scattered way, is that I abide by the second rule, which is that notes should be connected to other notes. And this is one of the great advantages of using digital tools to build a knowledge garden rather than paper-based tools. Links are kind of like a digital primitive, like this fundamental part of the medium. It's something that digital can do exceedingly well, much better than paper. Which isn't to say that people haven't done this kind of thing using paper before. I mean, I remember, a long time ago visiting library card catalogs, right? Like that's kind of like that's a paper-based indexing system, right? And there are people who have done similar things for their knowledge management systems. I think the most famous one is probably Niklas Luhmann's Zettelkasten system. And I know that Jorge Arango, who wrote a fabulous book on his system, which is based on the work that Luhmann did, and who was here in the meetup, right? That was a paper-based system. Luhmann's system was the Zettelkasten. That was it means in German it means slip box, right? So slips of paper, and he had these enormous cabinets at home that I imagine looking kind of like those library card catalogs, and it had a fairly elaborate kind of indexing scheme that allowed him to keep track of which notes were related to other notes. There are authors. Vladimir Nabokov wrote using index cards, and more contemporary ones, Ryan Holiday, who writes those books about Stoicism, and his mentor Robert Greene have also used index cards to make atomic notes. And the sense that I get from what they've, at least what Holiday has written about his system, is that he keeps the relationships together by keeping projects, keeping a set of cards in a box for each book project that he makes, right? But digital makes establishing connections between nodes so much easier, right? Like you don't have to keep elaborate indexing schemes or boxes or stuff like that. And when you can link nodes together, you can string together short ideas to express more complex ideas. And you can also cross-reference ideas, right? So that if I'm learning about a particular subject and I have a short node about that subject, and then later on I read another book that gives me new information about that subject, I can come back to that node and expand it. But also I can cross-link it to a node about that book, which opens up connections to a whole set of other ideas, right? So you end up developing this knowledge graph, which tools like Tinderbox or Obsidian, which we were talking about in the chat earlier, help you visualize, right? But you don't have to think about it from the visual perspective. You can just like take the notes in the moment and just think of the fact that links are a primitive of this system, so that you start thinking in terms of, rather than a large monolithic node that captures everything, I'm just going to break everything up and just trust that the system is going to keep everything together through these links. There are many, many different types of links. I cover the most prominent ones in the book, but the main point is that short enoughs aren't enough. You must connect nodes for this to end up working. And then the third and final rule I've already kind of alluded to, and it's that you need to nurture your nodes. And by nurture, I mean that you must return to them over time to expand them and to make new connections between ideas as you learn more. Like I said, if I read a second book, the book, I told you that I'm reading a book with a foreword that was co-authored by AIs. It's a book about strategy. And I've read several books about strategy, and I have notes in my system about strategy. And there are already ideas that I've read in this new book that I'm reading that I know are going to make it back into my system, because it's expanding my mental models about important ideas about strategy, right? And this is where the provenance thing, well, sorry, I didn't mention this in the links thing. I should have, but this is how I overcome this challenge that I think, Chuck, you brought up the challenge of provability of origin, right? And Michael, I know that you've talked about this as well. When you were on my podcast, we discussed this. The idea that if you connect these nodes, over time, you're going to be able to see where the ideas came from, right? And your notes about a particular subject will expand over time. But if you've been disciplined about keeping these, what I think are fairly simple rules, front and center, then you're going to be able to trace back where you found things. So nurturing means keeping ideas alive and relevant, right? Expanding them. So you start with short notes, but they don't stay short for long. Over time, hopefully they become longer, and maybe, you realize at some point that you need to break it up and make new notes, and it's a growing, living thing like a garden, right? So that's an important part of why I'm talking about nurturing. But the other reason why I advocate that you should nurture this is that you need to work on the system itself. You need to be on the lookout for new tools. And you're going to find that you have new needs. You're going to find that there are occasionally new tools coming in the market, like things like ChatGPT, right? And then you have to ask yourself, it's like, well, what role does this thing play in my knowledge garden? Can it help me? Or is it going to muddle things further? And this is why I said I might address your question, Chuck, about AI. It's like I haven't got definitive answers on this. I'm experimenting with it. but there are several different ways that one can integrate. As far as I've tried, there are a couple of different ways that one can integrate AIs into this system. But one thing that I am very careful in doing when I'm using something like ChatGPT with my notes is I always mark up the text that I paste that was generated by ChatGPT. I always mark it up as having been written by the robot. And the reason for that is that I want to be able to see very clearly what was the thing that I wrote and what was the thing that the AI wrote. Precisely because I want to be able to attribute things later, right? Like I don't want to start, first of all, I don't want to start citing the AI as though I had written that. But more importantly, like I want to be able to trace things back, right? So I don't want to make a model of this right now. And which is to say, I've been working on this, like I said, for a long time, and my system is not finished and it will never be finished. So nurturing doesn't just mean work on the ideas. Nurturing means work on the system itself. And a big part of that is trying out new tools. I think was it Steve? You talked about the process, right? Like the role that tools play in my system evolves over time. I currently use a tool called DevonThink as part of my knowledge garden, and I'm in the process right now of questioning if I'm going to continue using DevonThink, just because LLMs like ChatGPT are now providing capabilities that I get from using DevonThink. And if there's an opportunity for me to simplify, I might do that, right? I might replace the things that I use DevonThink for with other tools. So I'm constantly experimenting. So that's another aspect of nurturing the system. And then the last thing I'll mention here about this is that for me, it's also very important to expose my thinking to feedback from others, to opinions, right? Like that's why I wanted this presentation to be conversational. And I know that I'm dumping a lot of ideas on you, but I'm also sharing with you some ideas that are kind of half-baked, right? Like that matrix, this is the first time that I share it publicly. So very early days, and Andy Matuszak uses this phrase. I'm going to paraphrase it because I'm going to mangle it, but it's something like work with the garage door open, right? And I like that idea, so that you put your thinking, you build in ways of sharing your ideas so that you can get corrected, basically, or have someone suggest, hey, have you looked at this? And Michael, this is the diagram that I was referring to, that where I try to capture the process that I use. It's a kind of high level process for how ideas flow through my system. We can circle back to this if you want, but for me, it's the more important thing is thinking about these three rules, right? That you make short notes, you connect them, and then you keep in mind that that's not it. That's not the end of it. You have to keep working at it. You have to keep circling back, right? And it doesn't have to be a chore, right? Because when I say notes, this list, all of it says, make short notes, connect your notes. It sounds like work. I'm really talking about ideas, right? Like start thinking about ideas kind of in this kind of granular format and start connecting ideas. You're creating the place where you're going to be able to expand your mind in the same way that you do when you organize the coins on the table, or when you scribble the project plan on a blank piece of paper, right? You're looking to build a place that will help you think more clearly. And thinking clearly is essential to living a good life, particularly today when there's so much conflicting information, noise in the media, right? I think it's increasingly important for us to take agency in how we manage our thinking. And building a personal knowledge garden is an invitation to take control of the information in your life so that you can build it more skillfully. You can use it more skillfully, right? So your needs are going to change over time. I'm increasingly teaching more. So my career is going from like doing a lot of consulting and increasingly doing more teaching. I expect that eventually I will do mostly teaching in some way, shape, or form. And my needs are going to change. So it's important that my system evolve. I'm going to encounter new ideas. I'm going to meet new people. There are going to be amazing new technologies like AI and stuff that are going to bring new capabilities into the mix. So with some discipline and a spirit of exploration and play, this garden will evolve into a thinking space that brings everything together and nourishes you for the rest of your life. So that is the prepared remarks. I'm going to stop here. I see that there's a lot of stuff in the chat. I cannot see the chat. So, oh, and there's people with hands up. Why don't we start with Dave, because Dave had raised his hand before.
Sure. Great presentation, and thank you for what does that mean? I don't.
It's like applause. It's a silent applause, I think. I
Okay.
hope.
So I just want to push back a little bit. I'm 66 years old. I used to be a big technology guy, science fiction fan, loved computers. I am now in my dotage becoming a Luddite.
Okay.
So quickly, a couple things I put in the chat there. Watch the YouTube on unconventional thinking. It seems to me it's very easy to cultivate a lovely, beautiful knowledge garden of confirmation bias, that you shouldn't nurture your notes, you should challenge your notes, you should interrogate your notes, you should beat your notes and let only the strong survive. I beware of unintended consequences, that we are enamored by our tools and we fail to see how our tools shape our behavior. I see Mark frowning, but I just am skeptical of this new infatuation that we have, at least amongst those of us who are in this very small nerd community of note takers, that we have fallen in love with our tools and that we think they're precious. The real challenge is thinking and thinking clearly. And if you're not doing that, then putting it in a pretty PowerPoint animation isn't going to make it any better. So
Absolutely. I want to say that when you're saying resonates very strongly with me. I don't remember if I used this phrase in the book, but it's a phrase that I've written about in my blog post, and it's the word meta work. That's what I call it. And that's when there's work, there's doing the work, and there's doing work on the things that let you do your work. And in other words, like you do the work, or you work on the tools and you work on the system that the tool set up. And one of the challenges with this stuff is that the tools are very enticing, and it's very easy to become a dabbler in tools rather than a user of the system, right? And I think Andy Matuszak talks about this. The ultimate point isn't to build a garden, and the ultimate point isn't to use the tools. The ultimate point is to think better somehow, right? You're doing this in service to thinking better. You're not doing it for itself, right? And if it's not, I've seen a bunch of articles that with titles like personal knowledge management is BS, and then when you start reading it, inevitably, well, I'm not going to say inevitably, but I've seen a lot of them that the perspective is something like, hey, I was promised that I would just start writing in this thing and it would help me do these things automatically. And it's a chore. It's like so much work, right? It's like there's these expectations that are completely unrealistic about what these things are going to do. And then, these people move on and go to some other tool. It's like, you're not going to have easy answers. This requires work. And the work is thinking work. These are just tools to help us think.
And you need to know good questions.
Absolutely. And that's, by the way, that's an area where I think AI has a lot of promise. I don't know if you've seen Google's experiment, Notebook LLM, I think it's called. And one of the things it does is you upload your documents to Google Drive, and it'll scan your document and come up with prompts, like questions based on the thing that you've uploaded. And it's like a study aid, but I could easily see it being used to the phrase steel manning, right? Like it's like, what's the best argument? It's like the opposite of straw manning. When you build like a straw man argument, steel manning is how do you what is the strongest argument you can make for your opponent's point of view somehow, right? So it's like I could imagine prompting ChatGPT to look at the notes I've taken and saying, how am I wrong here? Like, what's the most obvious way in which this is like just completely bad, right? I haven't tried that, but that would be an interesting experiment, right? Anyway, Michael, you have your hand up.
Let's let Steve go first. He's been there longer.
Okay. Steve.
Steve frozen.
Oh, it looks like he froze.
Okay, so real quick, while hopefully his internet comes back. So I appreciate your process and where you're going. One of the questions I have, and I've heard a lot in interacting with the community, and I agree with you on those concepts called the atomic notes. And in all of my demo files, I stick those atomic notes in what I call the resources folder of my Tinderbox files. And by the way, I'm one of those that's using Tinderbox as my primary knowledge garden, as you know.
I was thinking of you when I said that. Yeah.
Yeah. And and it's this, and so I have a couple of questions that are coming to this. One is, I saw your graph and I like it, and it's a collection of tools. But do you have, is there a centralized strategy, or is it more of a decentralized strategy where all of these notes exist? Like where does the connection work happen? Within your particular tools. And then I have one other comment, and you can answer both questions. The other comment was, love the idea of atomic notes. That's why I have my resources folder. But in experiences like this, like you should see the laundry list of notes I've been taking while we've been going through this conversation today. I don't have the time to create atomic notes. Yeah. So I think there's a recognition of a step beforehand. Allow the Rorschach vomit graph of information to end up somewhere that you then can curate into a set of atomic notes. But expecting yourself to make atomic notes in the moment, I think is a bit of a high bar. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I found that as well. I can't do it when I'm taking notes, like transcribing a presentation, like like what I expect that some of you were doing today, just because it moves too fast, right? Now, I think that's one of the things where the tools have really made a lot of progress, in that the tool, and I think that this will answer your other question as well. The tool that I use primarily, as you saw in my little matrix diagram, where the main tool for my knowledge garden right now is Obsidian. And Obsidian is a markdown, basically a markdown text editor that has a lot of these things as native, right? Like, so it does wiki links natively and tags natively and all these things. But it's fairly lightweight, and the files are all saved as plain text markdown files in your computer. So you're not dependent on cloud providers and stuff like that. But one of the things that Obsidian, and it's not the only tool, I mean, I know that Tinderbox does this as well. One of the things that these kind of very hypertext oriented tools do bring to the table is that they reduce friction in creating links and creating new notes. So that if you try, well, first of all, a lot of people take notes using Apple Notes, right? Like that's the default note-taking app on the iPhone. So a lot of people use it. And it wasn't until the most recent release of Apple Notes, the one that came out this fall, that you could make links between one note in Apple Notes to another note in Apple Notes. Like you could add links to external resources, but it was also a cumbersome process. Like you had to go look for the thing, highlight it, press some, get a menu, get a dialog box. And you look at other tools like Evernote. That's another one that a lot of people use, and they make linking is cumbersome, right? Especially as compared to something like Obsidian or Tinderbox. And so that's one thing. They've reduced the friction. The other thing is Tinderbox has the explode notes capability, right? Which is one way to do it. Obsidian has something similar. In Obsidian, you can select you can select arbitrary text in a note, and it has a command that lets you extract that text into a new note. You just give it a name, and then it automatically breaks it out, creates a link to that new note. So these tools are, that's what I'm saying, like there's a plethora of new tools that bring this very kind of hypertext-oriented thinking to note-taking. And I'll just say one last thing there, and I realize that that a few of you had hands up, and we have a few minutes here, but you asked about links, Michael, and I think that that's one of the biggest challenges with such a system, that everything is still fairly fragmented. What I would love would be a universal, some kind of universal addressing scheme where I could point to anything from anywhere, right? And I do use Hookmark, and I forget the name. The founder has been a guest here, right? That's where I learned about Hookmark. So it goes some ways to doing that. But if you all haven't seen this, there's a project called Noosphere that's being led by Gordon Brander and his collaborator, whose name escapes me. And they're looking to define a protocol for doing this kind of thing globally. I mean, at internet scale. And I'm really excited about that project, because I think that that's one of the biggest challenges we have right now, that everything becomes kind of siloed in different tools.
Can you, I didn't get the name of the Noosphere. What is that? Or can you type that in the chat?
By Gordon. And he has a colleague who he's working on this, but I'm not remembering his colleague's name right now. And I'll look to see if I can find you a link. But yeah, that project is an open source protocol for this very thing, and I'm very hopeful for that. Steve, I think you were.
Steve's back to the unfrozen.
Sorry, my computer completely shut down. So in your model, you have take short notes, connect notes, and nurture notes. What strikes me is the last piece, the nurturing, is huge. And there's a whole universe of skills, decomposition and summary and sorting and categorizing and finding blank space and that sort of thing, that is all part of that nurturing piece. Has your interests or research pursued sort of that whole additional universe? It sort of seems imbalanced. You have two things that are pretty straightforward and one that is huge.
Yeah, it is. It is, and to your point, it's huge, and it's huge in a different at a different level, right? Because the first two are kind of mechanical things that you can learn to do, but the third one involves both understanding. So, like you were saying, like part of it is like categorization and this, defining taxonomies, and should you use tags or should you use folders? That's one of the questions that I get the most, right? So that's where the information architecture piece comes to bear here, and there is stuff in the book about that. But I'll say that I think that the more challenging part of this is actually not something that you can learn through, like, conceptually. It's actually like building the habits necessary to keep this up. And that, I think that will only happen if you make another leap, which is to see yourself as the kind of person for whom this kind of thing matters. There's this identity piece that is tied into this, right? So think of yourself as a someone for whom your relationship to knowledge is somehow important. Might even say like fundamental to success in your life. I think that if you can make that mental leap, then you'll be more willing to put up with the harder aspects of this. Like some parts of this are tedious, just like gardening can be tedious. If you have to reorganize your taxonomy, your tag taxonomy, that's not going to be as fun as playing around with new tools. But if you understand why you're doing it, and what it's ultimately in service to, I think that you're more willing to do it. I think that is kind of one of the harder things about that nurturing piece. But you're right to call it out. Thank you for bringing that up.
Mr. Bill.
Hi. You started to address my question, maybe, but I'm wondering what properties of the software that you use that goes in your gardening upper right section makes it long term. What are the qualities that you're looking for that makes those software programs that you use useful for long term as opposed to short term? I mean, you mentioned linking, but that can go in either. I don't see why that make something long term or short term. Is there some other quality that you're capturing that makes something more long term?
Absolutely, and again with the caveat that the one that I showed was like my personal take on it, and I know that it's going to be different for different people. But for me, I'll talk specifically about Obsidian, which is the one that I had in the upper right quadrant. For me, Obsidian ticks a couple of check boxes that I think are important. One is it is first and foremost a writing tool. And when I am capturing notes of the sort that I'm describing here, I am usually doing it by writing. I also sometimes make drawings, and I have ways of saving those in Obsidian as well. But I'm talking primarily about writing, right? And if I'm reading a book, my highlights go into the system. It's all kind of text-based. And part of the reason why I picked Obsidian for this task over other tools is that, well, there's a series of reasons, but for me, perhaps the most important is that that data is stored as plain text files on my computer's file system. So I know that Obsidian is a very small company. It's a few people, right? And I think that they've been successful. It's not open source software, but the personal, if you're going to use it for personal use, it's free. So you can try it out. It's got a very low bar to entry. But I have the confidence that if the company Obsidian goes away, I'm not stuck with useless nodes, because everything is plain text. And the fact that it saves plain text and Markdown also means that it can very easily integrate into other tools in my ecosystem. I mentioned DevonThink. DevonThink lets you index folders on your Mac. And because Obsidian saves its notes as folders, as text files on a folder in your Mac, then you can use your Obsidian notes within DevonThink. And DevonThink understands WikiLinks as well. So it's like it's got this openness, even though it's not open source. It's got this openness that I like, and I'm a big I'm convinced in this notion that Nassim Taleb talks about the Lindy effect, right? Like this thing that if something has been around for a long time, it's likely to stick around for a long time. And there are few file formats as durable as plain text. So for me, that's a big deal. I've used Unix command line tools to process my Obsidian notes. And those have been around for 40 odd, in some cases, 40 odd years, right? So I'm confident that the notes that I'm taking with Obsidian are going to be around regardless of what happens with other tools, in a way that I wouldn't be, for example, if I was using something like Notion that is all cloud-based. So that's the reason for me.
Thank you. That's just, it sounds like a foundational small building block for something that needs to be long-term, and a good one. So,
by the way, that's one of the reasons why I love Tinderbox is the raw XML file is imminently accessible and easily parsable. If in the event it were to go away someday, I mean, That's a very similar concept.
Absolutely, and I have to plead guilty to having edited XML, Tinderbox XML directly in BBEdit. Sometimes I'm like, where was this? And I've used it to like search for things, right? Search for strings. Like it's very useful to have something that you can edit in other tools.
By the way, on that note, and Tom Diaz made mention of this to me, there's a tool called Foxtrot. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
It's an XML searcher. So you can use Foxtrot to search into the Tinderbox XML. So if you're much like you're doing DevonThink for your Obsidian files, I use Foxtrot for my Tinderbox files. So I can search in across all of my Tinderbox files.
Oh, that's fantastic. Foxtrot, you said?
Yeah, it's awesome.
I'm going to have to check that out. Great.
I go, put a link.
Yeah, I'm looking it up right now. Maybe Tom's got it if he's still around there. Here you go, Foxtrot search. Yeah, this is a great tool, and so I get that same affordance of being able to look inside across all of my Tinderbox files using this tool. Chuck.
So just as a follow-up on some of the earlier conversations that I injected into this, you're just raising the point of, Obsidian is valuable to you because it's all on your computer, it's in markup, it's text, which you view as being fairly impermeable. But we also have a lot of applications that are going to the cloud, and many people who live on Google Docs and things of that nature. And that starts to get into the realm that I think is going to be a growing concern. Who's using the information you share through a cloud service? What are they doing with it? Is it training something, whatever that might be? But then also, how do you have proof of authorship, proof that it hasn't been manipulated or changed? I think these are the kinds of issues I was getting at in terms of the points I was raising, is we have so many tools being developed, and we just are missing the ability to control what we generate, but also, and I think this is equally important, the ability to ensure that the information we're bringing in is from a known source, not manipulated, not modified in transit, things of that nature.
Yep.
And I don't think there are ready-made solutions out there right now, but I think as we start looking at these issues, that's going to come front and center very quickly, because we just now have such powerful tools for manipulating things that can be used to good purpose or unfortunately used to bad purpose. So
I think that's spot on, and again, it's one of the reasons why I opt for stuff that is local to my computer, and I do use Obsidian. The company has a sync service, so obviously you can use things like Dropbox or iCloud or I would imagine OneDrive, which I don't use much, but you can use any of these services to sync your notes repository. But I think that's a choice, right? And it's a choice that you don't have when you're using cloud-based tools. You can choose to not use those things and to just work with your stuff locally. And this takes me to another reason that I like Obsidian right now. I mean, it might change in the future, but one of the reasons I like it is that it's built on a kind of modular architecture where it's expanded through plugins. And one of the plugins is there are several plugins that let you integrate with LLMs, including the GPT API, the ChatGPT API, and there's one plugin that lets you ask GPT stuff and add it to the note that you're working on. And there's another plugin that kind of, I don't know, I'm going to use the wrong words because I don't know the details of how it works behind the scene, but it basically allows you to consult your vault of notes through these LLMs. And in order to do that, I think it has to send the corpus over to the whatever engine is providing that service, right? So those are two very different uses of the AI. To your point about privacy, like I'm comfortable with using the one that lets me insert text from the AI in my note, but I'm not entirely sold on the idea of sending my entire corpus of notes over to the API, you know? And that's a decision that I make as an individual, because at this point, I feel like I have a certain degree of literacy about how these things work. And I just find that a lot of people don't have that degree of literacy, which is like, I suspect that this book that I've written is, y'all are probably way too knowledgeable to find it as valuable. It's written more for someone who like wants to get into this stuff, but doesn't know the basics, right? Doesn't know what are the things that I need to know to build one of these systems and what are the criteria, right? Like if I'm going to pick a tool to keep this, what are the criteria? Where I have preferences that I think you should look at. You should be mindful about privacy. You should be mindful about openness. Don't get locked in. If you're doing a thing that is going to last the rest of your life, what happens if the company goes out of business, you know? So just know that these are things that you need to be aware of. And I don't have the answers. I might help you like figure out what the questions are, hopefully.
I think one of the real tensions is going to be between people who are doing their own knowledge base on their own system in a tool that runs on their computer. That's fine. But if you are working in a collaborative environment with other people, then you're going to require other tools. Absolutely. And the power of getting other people's thoughts coming in, perish the thought, perhaps even an AI bringing some thoughts in, poses a bunch of difficult issues. And I'm not suggesting solutions. I'm merely pointing out that these are the kinds of tensions that I think are going to drive the future of what's going on here. And I'm trying to maintain an open eye and an open mind about where is this going and what is it going to do for us, and what protection should we be asking for.
Well, and on that note, though, Chuck, you brought up an earlier point too. Is what it really comes down to trust, and the fact that the risk of that company taking all of your intellectual property and making money from it and just leaving you in the dust. And they could tout to the nth degree that we'll never do that, but they will. It's just, or they can, and you'll never know if they can or not, and you may not know even if they do. I mean, so it's a real problem.
Right. Mm-hmm. That's all.
Chuck, I'll say one more thing about this. I'm so glad that you brought it up like this, because it kind of validates a tricky decision that I had to make in the book, which is I had to write about AI, and I wanted to include that kind of mindfully in the book. And the way that I chose to do it, after some kind of wrangling with my editor about it, very minimal amount of wrangling, I shouldn't dramatize it, but I put it in a chapter about collaboration. And it's about this very subject that you're saying. And it's, everything that I've been writing about and talking about today is like, it's for your personal knowledge garden. But what about when you're working in a team, right? And at that point, many of these principles that I've been talking about, kind of to your point, they're not applicable. At that point, you are going to have to use a tool like Notion, right? Which brings everyone on the same page. And I explicitly frame AI in the book as a collaborator more than a replacement.
But I'd like to interject before we lose the thought there on that point, though. I think one thing that's amiss is people are looking for that universal do-it-all tool, both an individual and a collaboration, for an example. And one thing I found is take the extra energy and effort, add the friction to your life, that if you are doing collaborative, bring whatever insights from that collaboration back to your personal tool. Right. And so continue to manage your own garden. And there's no reason why you can't manage both your own garden and the community garden. Absolutely. Right. And they're two different gardens, and think about it in that context. And I find that very helpful.
Absolutely. It's an ecosystem, and you have to approach it like that. David has been very patient.
Chuck, so I stumbled into CompuServe in a CompuServe forum, Case Tools, in, I forget, late 80s, I think. And it had been in chaos. And one of the characteristics of the new owners of the forum was that everybody had to post under their real name. So this, I think of this little community here, where basically, to a large extent, Michael and Mark know everybody. And so in the back to the CompuServe, it was very, very focused, very narrow on people who were essentially branding themselves, showing themselves as, I know this, here's my body of knowledge. Obviously out in the wild with X, Twitter, who knows who they are? You have no idea. And it's just something that people are going to have to learn, that if you don't know who this person is, don't believe what they're telling you. So
yeah, Howard Rheingold wrote a book about this, and it was written a long time ago. But I think a lot of these things apply, right? Like, and Michael, I think that this is your area of expertise, right? As well, identity.
Mm-hmm. Huge. All right, Win.
So just to follow up on what Chuck was talking about, and Chuck and I have had variations on this conversation going back probably longer than you would guess. Is I think that we'll see the usual pattern of this play out, is that over the next 2-3 years, we're going to see some incidents where there are mostly sort of minor, maybe a sort of a major problem in this, and there will be little flare-ups of, oh, we should do something about it. And then we'll have one really big one that has everybody panicking about it, in which case all kinds of things will start to happen that are not well thought out and make no sense. That's the way our internet history works.
I think part of that, by the way, just to interject, Win, is it not the case that it doesn't really matter until it's made it personal to me, either directly to me or, more importantly, to somebody within my second degree of connection? So in my research, we don't worry about our identity until either a family member or I am directly influenced. Otherwise, it's just noise, and I don't worry about it. And I think that's part of the reason why some of these things don't get out there into the market until it hits enough people.
Yes, and some of these things are harder to deal with, and in some cases we end up with what happens is the pressure drives actually solving things in a way that is reasonably usable, or that the users are just forced to have some extra inconvenience on it for not good reasons. The fact that we have really awkward two-factor authentication systems sort of shows both of those things in action. For it. I also wanted to comment on LLMs. So I recently grabbed one of the kits that makes it easy to run one of the open source LLM models on your own computer with a built-in chat web interface, just to make it easy to work with. And it's fascinating. To be able to do that, I haven't worked on trying to figure out how I import a corpus of interesting stuff for me into that, because I've sort of only had it for a short period of time. That, of course, does not solve the group work use, although it would not be hard to adapt that to sort of running it on a web server restricted to your group. It's just not that complicated a web application for it. So there's interesting work there. The open source models are not as powerful as GPT 3.5 or 4, but they're interesting to play with. The other thing is that they are interesting to play with is that they are really not hard to knock the safety guardrails off of. And you can sort of do this and see the results, like, on your own without being offended before it comes back and tells you for it. But it will do those things, and that just makes the safety issue more concrete as is this really a solvable problem at scale for it, without serious limits on things that would be reasonable points of interaction with the AIs So interesting to play around with those, but it's going to be a complicated future there as well.
Mm. It's moving so fast, and there, to your point, I just shared a link in the chat. Simon Willison has created some open source tools to let you interact with LLMs using the command line. So these are just traditional Unix style tools. And one of the things about the main tool is called LLM, and you can use either remote APIs like the OpenAI APIs, or you can download models locally if you don't want to be sharing stuff up to the cloud, right? I'm using it with OpenAI's API, but again, I'm being mindful of the sort of thing that I send up, right? But there's a lot of stuff to experiment with.
All right, everybody, we're about a little bit over, but this was just rocking good. I thoroughly enjoyed it, so thank you very much. Anybody else before we cut things off? Anybody else have any final comments, words, thoughts, or ideas, or shall we wrap up?
See everybody next Saturday for a meetup, and in 2 weeks for the Big Book Bonanza.
Awesome.
And thanks again to Jorge.
Yeah, Jorge,
Please
that's absolutely fantastic.
Please save the chat.
Thank you all.
Yeah, I'll save it and post it in about an hour or two.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, everybody.
Bye-bye.